Mutheu Kasanga. Mutheu, you have run education for a while. You have chaired the Private Schools Association. You're now at the Kenya Private Schools, not private schools, but the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, representing education and ICT. What's your, right now, what's your assessment of our preparedness for the transition into grade 10?
Thank you so much, Eric, and everybody who's spoken. Right now, we are transitioning the first cohort. And just right off the bat, I want to acknowledge the data from Musawa. 11% of places are in private secondary schools. And just also recognize that clearly what we are conflating as a CBC issue is actually an infrastructure issue that has been present for quite a while. I also want to acknowledge my colleague from Kupet that perhaps in addressing the fears of parents in 2022, a populist decision to keep the learners in primary schools in the end has hurt the learners completely. And the few JSS schools that are domiciled in secondary schools, we see the difference. There is a small number of predominantly private secondary schools that took a risk and worked with the recommendations of the Fatuma Chege report that allowed, that recognized that JSS actually should be in secondary schools, and that schools, private schools especially, can establish themselves in any formation, in many formats. And we are seeing a distinct difference in those kids who are in JSS children who are in established secondary schools. The way they have interacted with CBC is very, very, very different from the way the students in JSS primary schools are looking like. And it will be interesting to see at the end of this year what the outcomes look like. If we compare those few JSS schools in secondary schools, what the outcomes look like. Because like my Kupet colleague, I am convinced that JSS should have been in secondary schools. And we would have had an infrastructure problem, but would have had the correct teachers teaching the students.
Mutheu, I have a question. Just before you continue, Mutheu, quick question. Had we, for example, domiciled them in secondary schools, but from like the data that we got from Claudia is that it's only ideally working if you're, for example, in a national, school with 95% of them having fully functioning computer labs, having fully functioning chemistry and biology labs, etc. It seems as you go down to extra county, etc., then the infrastructure problem still becomes a gaping, problem. So would the issue still remain that you'd now have them in secondary schools, quote unquote, but still not able to access a proper education from the infrastructure perspective?
Good question, good point. And the point is this: the children would have had the right teachers from the get-go. At the end, as a country without adequate infrastructure, and this is where we must look at it from, because even the 844 kids in these schools still don't have the right infrastructure. But this is the point, and this is the dilemma that as a Kenyan nation, where we don't have the adequate infrastructure, where we must ask ourselves, which is better, to have 4 walls and no teacher, which is what we have ended up having with JSS in primary schools. The kids are in 4 walls, but there is no teacher. Or to have kids with the right teacher, but with minimal 4 walls, which would have been easier to achieve. A concerted effort to put in 4 walls in 11,000 plus schools, or the effort that we have seen has not worked in 3 years, to add secondary school infrastructure in 44,000 primary schools. And we're in that dilemma. And the sadder thing, in my opinion, is that there's a subset of data that needs to be very carefully analyzed. There are very many secondary schools sitting in compounds with primary schools. And as we speak today, the Form 1 class is empty in those schools. They share a compound. Just because the decision was made to domicile JSS in primary schools. I believe the percentage is something like 15% of day schools are sitting in compounds with primary schools.
Yeah. Yet those children are in primary.
And yet we cannot share that infrastructure. These schools are run by 2 separate boards. Those boards don't meet. So we have a mind block somehow about how we manage our schools. You know, when you look at other jurisdictions that have, let me call them comprehensive schools, because comprehensive schools ideally start from the first class of primary school to the last class of secondary school that leads to university, not this thing we are calling comprehensive. A comprehensive school sees a child through without need for movement. They typically have one board. They typically have one head, one principal, and several deputies. But here we are duplicating everything in a 10-acre compound, and you're left wondering, at the end of the day, are we really thinking about the child?
Right.
When we are trying to maximize the little infrastructure we have, because that is what we must do.
Yeah, Mutheu,
that is what we must